April 1st, better known as April Fool's Day. A day when people approach the world with max-level skepticism. The gaming world, of course, is no exception. On that day in 2003, the gaming industry experienced a seismic shift when two longtime rivals became one. So how did these two come together and produce a match made in RPG heaven? My name's Zio, and I'll be your lore keeper. To answer that, we need to look at both companies and their rise to fame. Our tale begins in the mid-70s, believe it or not. What if I told you Enix started off as something completely different? The Eidan Shiboshu Service Center was founded in 1975 by architect turned entrepreneur Yasuhiro Fukushima. The company started as a real estate tabloid publisher that served to connect property owners with potential buyers. In 1980, they established a subsidiary called Eidansha Systems, focused on real estate trading and brokerage, and Fukushima would try to spin this off into a nationwide chain of stores. But the venture went sideways, and it was time to pivot. Video games were starting to gain traction around that time, and Mr. Fukushima saw potential in this emerging market. So Eidansha Systems was rebranded as Enix, a combination of the words ENIAC and Phoenix. The ENIAC was the first programmable general-purpose computer, and of course the Phoenix was the mythical bird that rose from its own ashes. Enix tore a page out of the manga industry's book by seeking out programmers through a competition called the Enix Game Hobby Program Contest, which had a prize of 1,000,000 yen for a game prototype that could be published by Enix. Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura were among those discovered by this contest. Horii's entry was a sports game called Love Match Tennis. Horii was a graduate of Waseda University's Department of Literature. He also worked as a freelance writer for comics and magazines, including the prestigious weekly Shonen Jump. Now this will be important later on. Koichi Nakamura was a programming prodigy in his high school days. He worked as a paperboy to save money for his own computer, which he used to write programs for the NEC PC 8001. His work was even featured in I.O. magazine several times. This was a pretty big deal, since I.O. was the premier Japanese computer magazine. In 1984, Nakamura established his own studio, Chunsoft. The Portopia Serial Murder Case and Door Door were two of Enix's first major releases, but the actual development was done by Chunsoft. Their real claim to fame, however, was Dragon Quest, which began development in 1985 by Horii and Nakamura. Ultima and Wizardry were popular games in the West, but these games were both on PCs and had obtuse mechanics that weren't very approachable to the average gamer. Horii wanted to make an RPG for home consoles with a more streamlined experience that focused on storytelling and emotional involvement. Renowned Dragon Ball manga artist Akira Toriyama gave the game its distinct art style, while Koichi Sugiyama was the music man. Sugiyama was a classically trained composer and conductor, having scored several anime and TV shows. Dragon Quest was released in May of 1986 for the Famicom and home computers like the MSX2 and PC 9801. Initial sales for the game were quite modest. Remember what I said about Shonen Jump earlier? Who better to gas a game up in one of the most widely read publications in that demographic than the very man who created it? And of course it didn't hurt that the man behind Dragon Ball put his name on it. That bump caused Dragon Quest to sell over 1,000,000 units in the first 6 months. A second installment was already in the works before the first one was even out the door. Dragon Quest II sold over 2,000,000 copies by the end of 1987. The third installment, however, was where things really popped off. Dragon Quest III sold over 1,000,000 copies in its first day, with almost 300 arrests for Japanese students skipping school to buy their copy of the game. Even John Stossel mentioned it in his ABC 2020 segment called Nuts for Nintendo back in 1988. The success of Dragon Quest and its sequels kicked off the Japanese RPG gold rush of the late 80s and early 90s. By the turn of the decade, Dragon Quest wasn't just a franchise, it was an institution. In 1990, Enix started publishing games for third-party studios like Quintet and later Tri-Ace. They even entered the world of manga publishing. Dragon Quest was their bread and butter, but they also recognized the need to diversify. Dragon Quest made the jump to North America in August of 1989 as one of the first Japanese RPGs to be released overseas. The other one? Well, we've covered it rather extensively here. The name Dragon Quest was already trademarked in the US, so it had to be rebranded as Dragon Warrior. Dragon Quest had very basic graphics and relied on lengthy passwords to save progress. But since Dragon Warrior came out 3 years later, the graphics received a major glow-up, and the passwords were ditched in favor of a save battery. The dialogue for the game was translated into pseudo-Elizabethan English. Dragon Warrior didn't do quite as well in the US as it did in Japan. Nintendo grossly overestimated how well the game would do overseas and ordered 1 million copies of the game to be manufactured. In an effort to offload this surplus and build awareness of the RPG genre, Nintendo made a rather bold move. In the latter part of 1990, Nintendo Power launched a promotion that gave away a free copy of Dragon Warrior with every new subscription during the promo period. To sweeten the deal, they even threw in a 64-page guidebook. Despite attracting over 500,000 new subscribers through this promo, the game did not do well in Nintendo's eyes, and Enix had to publish subsequent games in the series themselves. The sequels actually wound up doing worse, due in no small part to the fact these games were released 3 years after their Japanese counterparts, which meant they had dated graphics. On top of that, Western gamers favored action titles, which were easier to localize and just sold better. Moreover, by the time Dragon Warrior 3 and 4 rolled out, the Super NES was already available and the appetite for last-gen games had waned significantly. And when Dragon Quest V came out in 1992, Enix in Japan didn't greenlight the translation because the game's code was too buggy and would have been too costly to fix. Enix published games by Quintet and other studios in the US throughout the 90s, but Dragon Warrior had all but gone dormant. DQ6 was supposedly translated, tested, and ready to go as Dragon Warrior 5, but by that time Enix had given up on the US market and just pulled up stakes.
Prepare thyself well, Dragon Warrior. Thy most challenging quest ever awaits. Go with speed, but go with patience. Seek out an arsenal, a dragon scale, a torch, and magic herbs. Use wisdom and cunning to choose thy commands, for the Dragon Lord is a fierce rival. Horrible and treacherous minions all guard the Evil One's island castle. Art thou ready, young one?
Yes, King Lord.
And so begins a new epic, Dragon Warrior.
Nintendo, now you're playing with power.
So, where was Square during this time? Square was founded by Masafumi Miyamoto as a software subsidiary of his dad's electric company, Denyu Sha. This was right around the time Enix was making their moves. Masafumi wanted to forge his own path and not follow in his dad's footsteps. Their first office was a hairdresser salon, and their first game was The Death Trap, released in 1984 on the PC 8801. In 1985, Square made a deal with Nintendo to make games for the Famicom, releasing a port of Dexter that year. The first original game on the Famicom was King's Knight the following year. This is around the time some familiar names would appear. You had Hironobu Sakaguchi, Hiromichi Tanaka, Koichi Ishii, Kazuko Shibuya, Akitoshi Kawazu, and Nobuo Uematsu, to name a few. Sakaguchi and Tanaka were among Square's first employees, both of whom were part-timers. By this time, Square had spun off from Denyu Sha, which meant that Sakaguchi and Tanaka were now full-time employees. Sakaguchi dropped out of college to pursue his career in the games industry. They also set up a new office in Tokyo's prestigious Ginza district. Around this time, Square started putting out games in the Famicom disk system, but the high cost of rent in Ginza, coupled with the string of failures on the disk system, put them in dire straits financially. Miyamoto would issue a request for game proposals, and Sakaguchi suggested they make an RPG in light of the success of Dragon Quest. He didn't want to simply copy Dragon Quest though. Miyamoto greenlit the project under the condition that it be made by just 5 people. Sakaguchi led the team and brought in Uematsu, Ishii, Kawazu, and Iranian-American programmer Nasir Gabelli. Square's other team, which included Shibuya and Tanaka, would join the project. This new RPG was to be called Fighting Fantasy, but someone else had the rights to that name, so Sakaguchi came up with the name Final Fantasy. This was to be a final Hail Mary for Sakaguchi, who started to doubt his place in the games industry. If this game flopped, Sakaguchi was done and would have to go back to Yokohama University. After a tumultuous 10-month development period, the world was introduced to a little gem called Final Fantasy in December of 1987. Final Fantasy sold over 400,000 copies in Japan. But unlike Dragon Warrior, Final Fantasy's North American release actually did better than its Japanese counterpart, selling over 700,000 units. By the mid-90s, Square was putting out banger after banger, with hits like Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger cementing their legacy. Despite facing similar challenges, Square was doing far better overseas than Enix ever was.
"桁違いのすごさだぜ!」「ファイナルファンタジー5」スーパーファミコンで好評発売中。スクエア。
So, where were these two by the turn of the century? Enix entered the 21st century in very good shape. Dragon Quest was still their top seller, with the 7th installment selling over 4 million copies in Japan by the end of 2000. Thanks to the PlayStation success, they even gave the West another chance with Star Ocean 2 and Valkyrie Profile. They even brought Dragon Quest VII stateside as the final game to use the Dragon Warrior brand. Despite their success, Enix was dealing with ballooning development costs. They were looking to merge with another company to help offset these costs. Square and Namco were 2 potential candidates. By the turn of the century, it seemed that Square could do no wrong. They finally had their breakthrough in the West with Final Fantasy VII and subsequently Final Fantasy VIII. With this newfound capital, Square set its sights on the silver screen. Square opened a studio in Hawaii as part of its Square USA branch, which served as a midpoint between Tokyo and LA. This new studio had the main goal of producing high-end CG films like Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. Several games were made in this studio, including Final Fantasy IX. The Spirits Within debuted in July of 2001 to a very mixed reception. It only grossed $85 million of its $137 million budget. Shortly after that debacle, several key figures like Hironobu Sakaguchi would step down from their positions. Enix saw this and they were like, "Excuse me? Baking powder? We want to merge with those guys?" So they pumped the brakes on the deal. Well, Namco wasn't doing so great at the time either, and they had to lay off a bunch of people. The failure of The Spirits Within put Square's future in jeopardy for the first time in over a decade, but they turned things around with Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts. Of course, it didn't hurt that Sony bought an 18% stake in the company. Well, they needed that money to help with the startup costs incurred by Final Fantasy XI. Enix invited Square back to the negotiating table, and the deal went full steam ahead in 2002. The main goal of this union wasn't just to offset rising costs. They also wanted to form a team with a combined talent pool that could go toe-to-toe with any studio in the West. Square had the talent pool and success in the West with Final Fantasy, while Enix had the publishing experience across multiple industries. Dragon Quest was still the hometown hero in Japan. 2 decades later, the union between 2 rivals remains one of the most important moments in gaming history. But what if none of this happened? What if Enix had cast their lot with Namco instead? Then we'd have an Enix Namco, or Namco Enix. Or dare I say, Nenix. Enix has the RPG pedigree of Dragon Quest, while Namco has fighting game royalty with Tekken and Soul Calibur. And let's not forget the Tales series, and of course arcade classics like Pac-Man. Enix might have given Dragon Quest an even bigger push overseas sooner, giving Final Fantasy a run for its money on both sides of the Pacific. But what about Square? Of course they'd still have their flagship franchises like Final Fantasy, Saga, Mana, and Kingdom Hearts. They might have been okay throughout the 2000s going into the 2010s if certain people stayed on board. Sony might have outright gobbled them up at some point. They already had an 18% stake in Square back in the day. It's fun to speculate what might have been, and how the gaming landscape may have taken a very different path over the past quarter century. If you enjoyed this, well, you know what to do. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a blessed day. And remember, to thy notes all be true. Until next time, farewell.